Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special event sponsored by Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com. I'm Jeremy Scahill, one of the co-founders of Dropsite News, and I want to thank all of our subscribers who have joined us today for this event. And we're speaking at a moment when the consequences of the U.S. support for Israel's genocidal war in Gaza are becoming more and more stark by the moment. We see a death toll in Gaza that has certainly surpassed 40,000 people. Those are conservative numbers, despite the fact that you hear a lot of attacks on the so-called Gaza, Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza. Those statistics are a dramatic undercount of the number of people that have been killed with U.S. Weapons, bombs, political support to Israel. And of course, we're monitoring very closely the horrifying news out of Lebanon, where apparently thousands of pager devices have detonated with some form of explosive in them, wounding thousands of people. We understand the death toll as of this moment has surpassed 10 people. And despite the media coverage about these attacks, which we believe to have been carried out by Israel, being aimed at Hezbollah officials, we understand that large numbers of civilians and non-fighters have also been injured and some killed, including a 10-year-old girl. So the stakes are very, very high. The United States, despite the rhetoric about not wanting a wider war, continues to support Israel as it threatens now to launch an all-out war against Lebanon. And the film that we're going to be screening tonight, I have to admit that since it came out some weeks ago, almost everyone that I've met, I've told them about this film because I think everyone needs to watch The Night Won't End, which was produced by Al Jazeera's investigative news program, Fault Lines. This is a documentary film that tells the story of three Palestinian families in Gaza as they fight to survive this genocidal war that the United States is sponsoring, funding, and backing politically, legally, economically, and militarily. And I'm really honored that my friend and the show's and film's executive producer, Laila Al-Arian, is joining me this evening. Laila, thank you so much for taking time to be here and to be here with all of our subscribers at Dropsite News.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Dropsite News, for hosting this event. And thank you all for tuning in. The War Won't End is a documentary about the war in Gaza, which has gone on now for nearly a year, as well as the role of the U.S. In this horrendous war and genocide. It was, of course, a team effort in every sense of the word. The director and producer was Kavitha Chukuru, and the correspondent was Sharif Abdel Kouddous, who will be joining us in the discussion after the screening. And we also worked with a team in Gaza who filmed for us over the course of months. You'll see their amazing work under the most difficult conditions you can imagine at a time when journalists are being killed and media workers are being killed in Gaza in record numbers. The film really focuses on the story of three families in Gaza and the terror and loss and bombardment and other war crimes that have happened to them that they both witnessed, survived, and lost family members to. We really wanted to paint a stark picture of what it's like for these individual families because we know that there's been such important and abundance reporting from Gaza, but we wanted to make sure to also personalize it as well as chronicle the role of the U.S. throughout. And I did reach out to one of the cameramen who worked on The Night Won't End. I told him about this screening, and I asked him if he had any message for you all, for this audience. And he said, and he's in the north, which has particularly suffered from starvation and Israeli bombardment. Of course, nowhere in Gaza is safe, as you'll see in the film. But what he said, and his name is Bilal Salem, he said, the only thing to say is that I hope the war ends. The world feels for us and does not get used to the scenes that are shown in the media. So please keep these words in mind as you watch the film.
Thank you, Laila. And just one note to our audience, if you're a paid subscriber to Dropsite News, you can post a question in the comment section of our post announcing the screening of this film. We're going to be asking your questions to Laila Al-Arian after the film, and we'll also be joined by Sharif Abdel Kouddous, who is working with us at Dropsite News, has been producing some really powerful journalism in the past couple of weeks alone. He's been coordinating our coverage with reporters on the ground in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as writing a piece for us today that looks at the latest figures out of Gaza for the deaths of people across the age spectrum, but really also focused on the deaths of children. And Sharif, just briefly before we go to the film, maybe you can just give us a really quick rundown of your latest story. Sharif is muted there, but if you can just unmute yourself for a moment, Sharif. Yeah, you're still muted. It's okay though, Sharif. We'll come to you right after the film screening. So as I said, you can post your questions in the comments section of the article. We're going to try to ask as many viewer questions as we can of Sharif and Laila. And without further delay, here is the incredibly powerful documentary from Al Jazeera English, "The Night Won't End."
البحر لما أقعد بالبحر وبطلع فيه خلص بحس إنه همومنا وجعنا كلها راحة. البحر كان هو الوجهة اللي برتاح فيها لما أقعد وأشوفها. إحنا حالياً رغم إصابتنا والوجع اللي إحنا فيه إنه نضل على قيد الحياة. يعني ممكن شوية النهار يهون علينا لو صار القصف إنه في ضوء وفي نهار في شمس. بيجي الليل طبعاً بالقلق وبالخوف وبالرعب، لأنه الليل بيعني لنا الخوف. مرات شفط البيوت بتروح بتنزل، مرات قصف بالإف 16. فدائماً أنا أولادي عن نفسي أطفالي عايشين بالرعب وبالخوف. دائماً يا ماما إشي بده يصير فينا، كيف بدنا نضلنا طيبين.
Hiba Salem and her family have been trying to survive Israel's war in Gaza for months. After Hamas's attack on October 7th, when nearly 1,200 people were killed and more than 200 were taken captive, the Israeli government launched an unrelenting war. The destruction and civilian death toll in so short a time has been like nothing the world has seen in decades.
The number of victims, the collective punishment, the denial of humanitarian assistance very early on, those violations of humanitarian law, the violations of the right to life, all the instruments that we've established in 1948 so far have proven to be, frankly, useless. We are really as close to the abyss as we have ever been.
ويعني والله ما بنام طول الليل بضلنا افكر فيهم بطلع على الصور بضلنا اعيط عليهم بنات صغار عمرهم يعني 6 سنين وبنت عمرها 8 سنين من دون ام ايه يعني ايه بكره ايش هالبنت من دون ام ايه يعني كل ما تقول له ماما وين ماما.
And despite the massive loss of life and numerous allegations from human rights groups of violations of international law, the United States, Israel's main ally, never wavered in its support.
I think the US has actual knowledge that war crimes are being committed. Of course we do. They are in the newspapers and on the television every day. And we certainly have other means of knowing what is happening in Gaza. And yet we continue to provide the arms that enable these. So inherently we are complicit.
Among Gaza's more than 2 million people, no family has been spared the impact of this war. To understand that struggle, we worked with journalists in Gaza to hear the stories of 3 families about their devastating losses and what it's been like trying to survive.
يعني بالذات الليل لما يجي برضاش يخلص. يعني حتى تصحى في الليل طول الليل بتكون صاحي بتقول بدهش يطلع الصبح بدهش يطلع الصبح. إياد لما بصحى بالليل بحط راسه تحت راسي، بخبي وجهه عن الليل، بقول لي خلصش الليل، بدوش يخلص الليل، مش راضي يخلص الليل. الليل طويل، الليل مرعب، الليل يعني خوف، الليل يعني إنك تذكر هند.
عمريش تخيلت أو توقعت كل الأحداث اللي صارت معنا من أول الحرب لحتى الآن.
One of the first losses Hiba and her family experienced in the war was their home. She and her husband Ayman spent 3 years renovating it for their 8 children.
وانتقلنا جديد لسه قبل 4 شهور، بيت واسع، حياة، قبال البحر، نطلع نتسوق، أولادي يروحوا على مدارسهم.
ذكريات حياة، نمط حياة، أسلوب حياة. هنا الروتين، نصحى والدي يطلع على السوق يتسوق، وبعدين يرجع بالصبح نعمل فطور ناكل، بعدين يطلع على الشغل تاعه. أبوي كان يحضر لنا العشاء مع الوالدة، كان في الحمص يطحن ويعمل لنا فلافل بالليل لأنه هو كان يحب الفلافل.
والحمد لله إنه عشنا حياة طبيعية، حياة حلوة، حياة سعيدة. يعني إحنا كنا مثلا لو كنا نحكي دائما على سبيل المثال بده يصير حرب، كنا نحكي تصير تصعيد على أسبوع، 10 أيام بالكتير، إن طارت مش هتعدي الشهر. والله ما رضينا نطلع من البيت.
When their neighborhood in northern Gaza was bombed, they were forced to flee their home in search of safety. They came to stay with relatives in this building, not far from their home.
وكل تفكيرنا كيف بدنا نكون بخير، كيف أنا بدي أحتضن أولادي، جوزي يكون طيب وبخير، بناتي بخير، أولادي بخير، ما نتعرض للأذى، ما نتعرض للقصف، ما نتعرض لإصابات، نكون بأمان. هذا كل تفكيرنا.
نسمع النشرة الإخبارية على أمل إنه يكون في هدنة، وقف إطلاق نار، وإحنا كنا محاصرين طبعاً يعني، وكان القصف عندنا قريب كتير. كان رعب الليل رعب بشكل لا يوصف يعني، حتى وإحنا نايمين ما ننامش مرتاحين، ننام غفوة زي ما بيحكوها، مش إنه نوم كامل كمان يعني، لا سمح الله صار فينا شيء نقدر نعمل يعني.
Their worst fears came true early in the morning of December 11th, when a massive airstrike hit their building. Al Jazeera's cameras captured the aftermath.
يعني استهدفت قوات الاحتلال صبيحة هذا اليوم منزل عائلة سالم، منزل يكتظ السكان في حي الشيخ رضوان في مدينة غزة.
Like thousands of other buildings in Gaza, it was completely destroyed and hollowed out. Family homes turned to ash and rubble.
ما لحقوش يصحوا الناس، ما سمعنا إلا صوت انفجار، دب هزز المنطقة، تهزز زي ما أنت شايف كيف كله سلاح.
Hiba, her husband and children were injured but survived. However, according to witnesses, more than 100 people were killed.
وكتير فقدنا من العائلة، وأولاد عم جوزي، بنت عمته، كتير فقدنا من العائلة. اتصابنا، بناتي 2 صبايا تصابوا إصابات خطيرة، على أساس إنهم أصلاً لما طلعوا شهداء. وابني تصاب بطل يشوف بعيونه، وإحنا تصابنا كلنا بوجع، في ألم، ما عرفنا وين أصلاً بدنا نروح بحالنا أو لمين نلجأ. مين اللي بده يسعفنا ومين اللي بده ياخدنا.
اخوتي المصابين اقدر الاقي مكان يقويهم كمان، لانه في من اخوتي ما بيقدروا يتحركوا، يعني البيت كان غير صالح للسكن.
ما في مكان محدد، يعني انه حيكون بخير. يعني كل مكان احنا بنروح فيه متعرضين فيه للخطر، متعرضين فيه للخوف، متعرضين فيه لضرب المدفعيات، متعرضين فيه للقصف.
"102 names we found were killed in one moment, effectively. But there were also allegations that it might have been 200 people who were killed. This is something we've seen multiple times in Gaza because people are trapped under rubble for a really long time."
Air Wars, which monitors civilian harm, has been documenting airstrikes in Gaza. We asked them to examine the December 11th attack.
And what happened in this strike was you had an attack on several different buildings. So when you go through our kind of investigation, you'll see that we split out all of the members of the family by which home they were in order to understand really the scale of devastation.
هنا ينتشل أهالي الشهداء وهم أشلاء مقطعة.
Do you know how many children were killed in the attack?
So we estimated 50 at least.
And how common was this type of attack that you investigated on December 11th?
I would say this is one of so many.
وامي واخويا واختي ولادي اثنين ماليش غيرهم، ولادي اثنين كمان راحوا. انا اولادي ابني وابني ومرتي وبنتي وبنتي وبنتي. هذا طفل لا يبلغ عمره ايام، مولود في الحرب. هذا الطفل ايش سوى؟
We have documented time and time again almost 100 people being killed in a single strike. This is the conflict where we have counted more children killed in a single strike than we have in any other conflict, multiple times.
كل أحفادي نسوانهم وأولادهم بجزانهم.
نسعى نخبر زي في مجزرة، وين الدول وين العالم تقف معانا تشوف كيف نسوان وبنات وأولاد كلهم ميتين. وين كنتوا بتتفرجوا علينا؟
When we all look back and when we finished counting, I think we're going to see it as a typical case rather than the exception.
אנחנו במלחמה, לא במבצע, לא בסבבים, במלחמה.
From the beginning, Israeli officials signaled this would be different than previous wars in Gaza.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם ואנחנו נוהגים בהתאם. עזה לא תחזור להיות מה שהיא. חמאס לא יהיה. חסל את הכל. קח זמן. ייקח יום, ייקח שבוע. קח שבוע ואולי חודשים. אנחנו נגיע מכל המקומות.
We're at war. We are at war. We are defending our homes. We're protecting our homes. That's the truth. And we will fight until we'll break their backbone.
The scale and intensity of like the human loss and the human suffering, but also of like infrastructure, homes, universities, hospitals, cultural centers, mosques, just like the total decimation of life is like quite different from most other conflicts I think we've monitored.
If you look at Raqqa and Mosul, these are also areas where you had, vast civilian harm in these environments. The highest number is still about 250 in those cases, compared to 1,000 incidents just in 1 month in Gaza.
What we're seeing now is that this conflict has like decimated the ability of so many families to live normally, the ability of so many families to be able to plan for the future, even to know what the next day holds.
كم شهيد عندكم يا حاج؟ كم شهيد؟
فوق ال 120 شهيد.
امريكا اللي بتحارب فينا مش صغير. امريكا جيش امريكا كله متآمر علينا، امريكا متآمر معاهم، امريكا مش توقف الحرب، ايش دعمنا لها امريكا احنا؟
I want to say to the world and to terrorists everywhere that the United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back.
As a staunch ally of Israel, the US provides billions of dollars in military assistance. And from the beginning of the war, the Biden administration made their unwavering support of Israel clear, regardless of the quickly rising civilian toll or the lack of any clear military plan.
This is war. It is combat. It is bloody. It is ugly. And it's going to be messy.
You said you've asked them tough questions, but has the U.S. set or discussed any possible red lines?
No.
President Biden takes this issue extremely personally, has since the 1970s, sees himself as a committed Zionist. One pretty senior former Israeli official said to me, the US with one phone call could stop the war. They know what the call would look like. The Israelis know what the call would look like. So Israel could not prosecute this offensive in Gaza without US support. What do we mean by US support, right? We mean bombs, we mean fighter jets.
I think in the first month or two, it had dropped 22,000 bombs on Gaza. This, of course, is a territory about the size of metropolitan Las Vegas. That's a level of devastation, as NGOs have noted, that has not been seen since the carpet bombing of Germany at the end of World War II. And I think just demonstrates the lack of attempts to protect civilian life.
Josh Paul worked at the State Department for over a decade, overseeing arms transfers to countries including Israel. And within the first days of this war, he was alarmed by what he was seeing.
By October 9th, I had written to colleagues within the State Department, senior officials and equals in rank, to say we need to think about this, about how US weapons are being used in Gaza right now. So I continue to see what we were learning from the government of Israel directly itself through sensitive channels, if there were any indications there of any intent on their part to protect civilians. And by 10 days in, none of that was happening.
That was when he decided to resign.
It was clear at the point that this was going to be far worse than any previous of the conflicts I'd been in government for. There was also this inability to shift the dial at all. What the United States has been doing by pushing 23,000 precision-guided munitions to Israel since October 7th is essentially letting Israel go forward without having to make hard choices.
Will those in favor of the draft resolution...
On the same day Josh Paul resigned, when the death toll had approached nearly 3,500 people in just 11 days,
Those against?
the US vetoed the first ceasefire resolution at the United Nations.
Colleagues, the United States is disappointed this resolution made no mention of Israel's rights of self-defense.
The US at that point says, we're not going for a ceasefire. That's a really striking moment, right? Because the contours of the war are clear at that point, even if the Israeli ground invasion into Gaza has not yet begun. I think that was a moment where it became clear the US in all levels is going to let Israel pursue this military campaign as it sees fit.
What are the chances of a Gaza ceasefire? None. No possibility.
Quienes estén a favor del proyecto de resolución, sírvanse levantar
By
la
December, the US vetoed yet another ceasefire resolution at the UN.
mano. En contra.
By then, more than 17,000 Palestinians had been killed. And that same month, the Biden administration bypassed Congress twice to transfer more weapons to Israel, a move they defended in the media, even as civilian casualties continued to climb.
We want to make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself against Hamas.
This drew more scrutiny on the use of US weapons and whether or not international law had been broken, particularly when it came to proportionality, meaning that there shouldn't be excessive civilian harm in military attacks, like in this strike on the Jabalia refugee camp in October, where Israel says they were targeting a single Hamas commander, but more than 100 civilians were killed.
There are reasons to be concerned that Israel may have a very expansive definition of military advantage, which would allow for, in turn, a great deal of civilian harm. Dropping a one-ton bomb on a house because there's a single Hamas fighter there, knowing you'll kill his extended family and destroy the entire neighborhood, would likely be excessive and be prohibited by the law of war. This is something that the U.S. government should be investigating and pressing Israel on, because there are U.S. weapons being used in these attacks.
In the case of the December 11th airstrike that killed over 100 people, it's unclear how many, if any, Hamas fighters were killed. Or in this attack in February, when a prominent human rights lawyer, her father who was a doctor, and most of their immediate family were all killed. The Israeli military did not respond to our request for an interview or our questions about either attack. Attacks like this raise questions not just about proportionality, but another key part of international law: targeting and indiscriminate bombing.
At best, the Israeli authorities are not taking the precautions they are supposed to take. At worst, they are intending to kill Palestinian men, women, and children, unrelated to Hamas or any other military target.
Since the war began, Amnesty International has investigated a number of Israeli airstrikes in Gaza, in which they found no legitimate military targets, only civilians.
We have documented the use of US weapons in the obliteration of civilians' families. That was demonstrated by Amnesty International already in several October strikes, and we have again demonstrated that US-made weapons were used against civilians in January in Rafah. There was no evidence of military targets, and yet the United States and others have continued to sell or transfer weapons to Israel. Those weapons have been used to commit crimes under international law. The magnitude of those violations, the number of violations, the scale of the violations is unprecedented.
As the death toll approached 20,000 people, mostly women and children, the Biden administration repeatedly defended their support, saying that the Israeli military was following international law and creating safe zones for civilians.
They have published online maps of places where people can go or not to go. That's basically telegraphing your punches. And there's very few modern militaries in the world that would do that. I don't know that we would do that. To put a map out there and say, hey, here's where you can go where it's safe, and here's where you shouldn't go because we might be striking there.
By the end of the year, more than 800,000 people had crowded into the southernmost city of Rafah, following Israeli orders to go to designated safe zones.
اتصلوا علينا بالصوانات، بعثوا لنا المخابرات الإسرائيل، بعثوا لنا الصوانات اطلعوا إلى الجنوب، اطلعوا الجنوب.
When our team in Gaza met Abdallah Al-Ghaf, he and his daughters had been living in this small tent in Rafah for about 3 weeks. Before coming here, they were sheltering in the nearby city of Khan Yunis after fleeing their home in the north.
عشت بيجي شهر بخان يونس، عشنا معاناة كتير صعبة، ما لقناش إلا طحين يا أولادنا، الأكل ما كناش نلاقيه يا أولادنا، ما كانش في إشي موفر. الصبح بالليل ناموا معي أولاد، الصبح بدري أكلوا معي وانبسطوا معي وكل إشي. اللي هو الولد الصغير بقول لي يابا، بقول له نعم يابا، قال لي يابا بدي بسكوت، بسكوت بطعمر كنت أجيب له. ورحت اجيب له بسكوت بطعمر، طلعت على السوق اجيب له.
Not long after he left to buy biscuits for his 2-year-old son, Firas, there was an attack on the building where they were staying. Abdullah's daughters can be seen here in this video from the Red Crescent.
أنا كنت قريب الشظايا طاروا علي الشظايا صاروا أنا من حب ما بقول لك سمعت الهواء ربنا حسيت قلت يا رب استر أولادي يا رب استر أولادي.
His wife Merihem was one of at least 11 people killed in the attack, along with Firas.
كان نفسي كان يعني طول النهار أضلني حامله أطلع فيه كنت يعني كان لما أبقى مزعلان هو اللي يبسطني في الدار يعني كان روحي الثاني ابن فراس الصغير.
جبت لك إياه يابا اللي بدك يابا خليه معك خليه معك.
يوم حطيت البسكوت بكفن الولد كان شعوري يعني حزين كثير ما كنتش يعني مخي كان طاير من كثر الزعل يعني ايش تجيب البسكوت الولد ما تلاقيش ابنك تلاقيه نايم تمه كله رايح تمه من هنا هيك كله رايح الولد يعني.
جنوب آمن جنوب آمن طلعنا على الجنوب طلعنا بالجنوب.
His cousin's 3-year-old son, Farid, was killed that day as well. Abdullah's 2 daughters, Nagham and Wadad, survived, as did his oldest son, 8-year-old Muhammad, but he was injured.
بقول له يابا كنا قاعدين نلعب أنا وأخوي فراس قاعدين وأمي كانت واقفة على باب الأوضة وما درينا إلا إشي خبط بالحامة انفجار قوي في الدار إلا إشي أسمر صار وبقول لي ما دريت إلا جوز خالته الصاوب وبقول لي أمي ارتمت على الأرض وأخوي صار الدم ينزل منه هيك صار يصوت وما بعدين ما بقول لي ما حسيت بإشي.
As the new year began, Gaza's hospitals, including Nasser Hospital where Muhammad was treated, were already under attack and barely functioning, with fewer and fewer supplies and more critical patients.
25 يوم قاعد يعيط بده إبرة بده دواء يا دكتور طول النهار أروح الدكاترة أدخلهم وإيش الفائدة فيش بالمستشفى دواء له.
والله بجعني كسرة معي كسرة معي
تخلي كاملة وقتك وتروح وبسيك إن شاء الله بدي أروح لغات. باي حبيبي.
Unable to get the treatment Muhammad needed in Gaza, Abdullah was finally able to get permission for his son to be evacuated to Egypt. But by then, it was too late.
محمد طلع من مستشفى ناصر وهو مخلص طلع على مصر لكن كان جسمه متسمم يعني كان متورم وجهه يعني بتقدم يا الولد يتعالج بأي دولة عربية بيستنوا عليك عبال ما يجي يموت عشان يطلعوا لك إياه يموت بمصر يموت في دولة برا لأنه هو طلع اليوم تاني يوم مات. اليوم فيش عندهم ولا في نتف أمان ما هاي نحن في الجنوب بضربوا عنا هاي جينا من الشمال على الجنوب على نتف الآمنة اللي اليهود اعتبروا إنها آمنة وخبطونا فيها.
Attacks in the south, like the one that killed Abdullah's wife and sons, continued as more people fled, looking for safety.
You can see here the blue areas are the areas that people were told to evacuate to. This is Rafah, which is the southernmost part of the Gaza Strip.
As part of their monitoring of the war, Air Wars found that areas designated as safe zones were frequently bombed.
I think we have 200 incidents in these safe zones from December to March. People were told these areas are safe, and they had to make very difficult decisions about whether or not they could trust that guidance. What we saw time and time again was that these areas continued to have allegations of civilians that were being harmed or injured because they'd moved there or because they already lived there. Those allegations didn't stop just because an area was designated as safe or seen as safe. Those allegations continued.
So as the bombing increased, it also increased in the south where civilians were told to go to?
Yeah, absolutely, I think. It's kind of hard to believe that there's any pocket or any part of Gaza that is safe for civilians to either move to or be in.
At the end of 2023, when the Al-Ghaf family was attacked in the south, more than 21,000 Palestinians had been killed. And more journalists and aid workers had been killed in Gaza than in any other conflict of the past few decades. By then, the Israeli government had also continued to restrict humanitarian aid, and starvation had begun to spread in the north. The US administration continued with their support.
As Israel's campaign moves to a lower intensity phase in northern Gaza, and as the IDF scales down its forces there, we agreed today on a plan for the UN to carry out an assessment mission. It will determine what needs to be done to allow displaced Palestinians to return safely to homes in the north.
Despite US words, by the new year, the north was still dangerous for civilians.
كانت غزة بالنسبة لنا يعني كثير قلنا بدكم تهاجروا بدكم تطلعوا من غزة ما كناش نفسنا إنه نهاجر لأنه إحنا كنا عن جد حاسين حالنا في بلدنا وقاعدين ومبسوطين فيها يعني أهلنا حوالينا شغلنا حوالينا أولادنا حوالينا بنكبر مع بعض وعايشين كل الظروف كنا عايشينها حلوة مع بعض.
With airstrikes in the south, some families who had fled the north went back there, trying to find some form of safety. Like Wissam Hamada. After fleeing to the south on orders from the Israeli military, she and her husband were separated.
أبويا وزوجي كانوا بسيارة تانية ما قدروش يصلوا للمكان اللي إحنا وصلنا له من شدة القصف. فمن الخوف صارت أمي تحكي لنا اكتبوا يما أسماءكم على إيدكم لو استشهدتوا يعرفوا أنتوا مين. أنا حكيت لها في هذا اللحظة من حد ما حكيت لأمي هذا الشيء حكيت لها أنا يا أمي بدي أخذ أولادي وأرجع على غزة عشان لما أستشهد يعرفوا إني أنا وسام حمادة.
She came back to the north with her 2 children, Iyad and her 6-year-old daughter, Hind. They stayed with relatives, including Hind's 15-year-old cousin, Layan.
كانت تحكي لها لا أنا بدي أطلع جراحة أنا بدي أحكم أكتر منك يا هنود. بتقول لها طب أنت كوني طبيبة جراحة وأنا طبيبة أسنان ونفتح عيادة مع بعض.
But in the north, safety was impossible to find. Late on January 28th, there were heavy attacks by Israeli forces in Gaza City, near where Wissam and her children were staying with relatives.
أمامنا أحزمة نارية بشكل مرعب جداً لدرجة النار تخش على البيت اللي إحنا فيه. حاولنا إن نتوسط المنزل وبطلع في هنود بحكي لها يا هنود تعالي نامي عندي. هي مغمضة عينيها وأنا أطلع فيها أقول يا الله يا إمي ما أحلاكي معقول بدك تسيبيني يا هنود.
The next day, the family decided to leave once again in search of safety. It was cold and raining hard. Wissam's uncle Bashar left with his wife and children, including Layan. Hind went too.
حكى أنا بدي أخذ أولادي وولاد بنت أخويا أحطهم في السيارة ونتوجه لمنطقة أبعد من المنطقة فيها وبدي أرجع أخذكم. فحطينا أولادي في السيارة يد نط من السيارة بدوش يروح.
But soon after they left, Wissam says the car was fired on by Israeli forces.
في ناس تنادي في الشارع إسعاف. اكيد ما شفناهم بطل قصير بس قلنا يمكن اللي في السياره عايشين ولانهم راحوا على منطقه هيك يعني هيك راحوا شويه على جهه اليسار قلنا صفوا في المحطه اكيد يعني هم بامان. يعني بدنا نطلع من باب العماره خايفين نطلع من باب العماره اي حركه في الشارع بيتم اطلاق النار علينا.
Wissam and the rest of the family fled on foot, and when they found shelter, she began calling her uncle who had been driving.
صرنا نرن على الجوال في الشي رد 12 بالضبط ردت ليان. ليان انتوا عايشين البنت من صدمتها صدمة توتر خوف مصابة ما تقولنا اسمعوا أنا كل اللي في السيارة بتحركوش نايمين فيش اللي أنا وهند عايشين. أنا مصابة أنا كل مطخوخة هند مصابة هند بتنزف أنا بنزف.
Eventually, relatives were able to reach the Red Crescent in Ramallah to see if their team in Gaza could send an ambulance.
وصلتنا مناشدة إنه في سيارة استهدفت عنكزية فارس في مدينة غزة.
When Omar called, it was Layan who picked up.
ألو مرحبا عمو. ألو مرحبا. أيوة تدخل علينا. الدبابة جنبي. أنتوا متخبيين؟ في السيارة إحنا جنبينا الدبابة. أنتوا جوا السيارة؟ ألو؟ ألو؟
بنتي تموت معك على التليفون. أنا فصلت يعني وصلت مرحلة إني أنا صار معي قط. يعني بالنسبة لي أنا مدرب مهيأ لهيك شيء بس لما توصل لمرحلة طفل شوي هون المشاعر هيك بتفوت في بعض كلها صراحة. بعد ما رجعت رنيت على التليفون على نفس الرقم اللي ردت علي ليان عليه. ألو هون اختلف الصوت علي. بسألها بحكي لها البنت اللي كانت تحكي معي وينها؟ هون حكت لي ماتت. هون أنا حكيت مع مين؟ مع هند.
أنت تخبي أنت وين موجودة بالضبط؟ في السيارة. أنت في السيارة قاعدة؟ طب تخبي تحت الكراسي ما تبيني بالمرة.
After a few minutes, Omar asked other colleagues to help and speak with Hind.
الدبابة وين؟ الدبابة جنبكم؟ ما عم تتحرك ولا واقف؟ نزل حدا منها؟ تتحرك؟ هي بتتحرك جنب السيارة ولا هي جاي من ورا السيارة أو من قدام السيارة؟ من قدام السيارة. هي جاية عليكي من قدام السيارة الدبابة؟ نعم. قريب كتير؟ كتير. وعم تمشي؟
As the Red Crescent dispatchers spoke with Hind, colleagues were trying to get an ambulance to her, something that would require coordination with and approval by Israeli authorities.
حبيبتي صدقيني إنه عم نعمل في تنسيق إن شاء الله يزبط.
Usually ambulances in the whole world, once they got the call, they directly dispatch the ambulances and send to save people's life. Unfortunately, this is not the case in Gaza. Any area that there is Israeli occupation forces, Israel considered as it is a military zone. That means even if there is wounded people, people who are killed and need to be evacuated, we are completely denied access to these areas. And if any ambulance try to reach, it will be targeted. That's why in order to be able to save Hind, we had to coordinate our safe access.
While they waited for approval, the team continued to speak with Hind.
Hind was screaming for help, was
asking again and again to come and rescue her from where she is.
Nisreen works in the Red Crescent's mental health department and tried to help Hind keep her hopes up.
هنود حبيبتي بس خدي نفس وغمضي عينيك شوي، ريحي عينيك شوي، لا إحنا عندك.
In the middle of the exercise, breathing exercise or imagination exercise, she will say, Nisreen, when are you coming to take me? And this has continued on and off all the time, trying to take her direction out of the car, out of the victims around her, out of her murdered family around her. The smell of the blood, can you imagine with me that a 6-year-old is afraid, is hungry, is thirsty, smells blood around her all the time. Dark is coming on soon, and only the phone is her hope. My voice, Rana's voice, Omar's voice, my colleagues, was her only hope.
Eventually, the Red Crescent was able to connect Hind's mother onto the phone with them.
احكي لها هند انت يا ماما بالراحه، انت مصابه؟ انا مطخوخه في ايدي من فوق، وانا مطخوخه في ظهري، وانا مطخوخه في رجلي. يعني انت رجلك بتنزل دم، رجلي بتنزل دم، وايدي بتنزل دم، وظهري بنزل دم.
Finally, nearly 3 hours after requesting clearance, the Red Crescent says Israeli officials gave the approval for the ambulance to go to the scene and provided this map with an approved route.
We had to wait almost 3 hours until the green light was given. So they sent a map with a route, which means it identifies exactly which route the ambulance should take. And once we received the green light, the ambulance was dispatched.
أحلى خبر في الدنيا من عمو عمر.
هند هنود هاي دقيقة واحدة بتكون السيارة عندك، بس بتمشي شوي شوي.
محطة فارس. وين وصلت؟
The 2 paramedics who started driving to the scene were Ahmed al-Madhoun and Yusuf Zeno. By the time they left, the sun had set.
شايف السيارة أنت؟ مش شايف مشغل السرينة واللواح؟
The connection to the ambulance was lost right after that loud noise.
يا زينو.
هند بخير؟ الحمد لله الحمد لله بخير، هي بخير.
They had to ask her, did you hear a bomb now? Did you hear anything around you? And she said, yes, I heard it. Her yes means our colleagues who went to rescue her had died.
The phone call with Hind continued, but her voice had started to grow fainter.
في هذه اللحظة هنود كانت تقولها هنود ليش انت بتتكلميش؟ بتقولها بتكلمش، بنزل من تمي دم. بتقولها مسحيه في ايدك وقولي لي كمان اذا بنزل كمان دم. بتقولها بديش اوسخ بلوزتي عشان ماما ما تتعبش. قلت لها معلش يا ماما امسحيه وانا بدي اغسل لك يا حبيبتي. قالت لي ماشي. بنت مسحت بتكمها زي هيك واختفى الصوت. كانت الساعة 7 بالضبط، اختفى تماماً الصوت. قعدنا في المستشفى، بيتنا في المستشفى، وإنه نستنى عدها إجا الهلال، عدها إجا الإسعاف. يعني أنا أطلع يعني في الليل كذا إسعاف إجا، أفتح السيارة إجا أنطنط إنه بدي بنتي تكون اللي في الإسعاف، ما إجاش الإسعاف.
It would be 12 days before Hind and the two paramedics' fates were confirmed, when Israeli forces left the area and civil defense workers were finally able to make their way to the site. This is what was left of the ambulance that tried to get to Hind. We spoke with 3 civil defense workers who went to the scene that day.
لقينا بعض العظم، جمجمة وفقرات وحوض، والجمجمة الثانية حتى ما لقيناهاش، مبين إنه مكان استهداف.
عندك يوسف زينو وأحمد المدهون. هذول من أبطال الميدان اللي في حياتي ما راح أشوف زيهم. اللي هو عارف إني أنا رايح أموت وعادي بروح.
مستحيل حد يكون انحرق قد ما كنت أنا أسمع في صوتها وهي بتحكي تعالوا خدوني مش قادرة أصل لبنتي. صعب كتير صعب، والله أصعب شعور في العالم إني أسمع بنتي بتقول لي تعالي خديني ومش قادرة أوصل لها. يا حبيبتي يا ماما والله ما قدرت أوصل لك، سامحيني يا حبيبتي. قدرتش أوصل لها.
The Israeli military did not respond to our questions regarding the attack on Hind and her relatives, but in previous statements have said that their forces were not in the area that day.
This is our 3D model of the Kia. You can see that.
To understand what happened when Hind and her relatives were attacked, we worked with forensic architecture.
Could hear distinct gunshots
and the audio research nonprofit Earshot to reconstruct a timeline.
So this is a satellite image that was
Satellite imagery taken that day shows Israeli tanks up the road from where the family car was parked at the gas station. This is at 3:31 p.m., about an hour after Layan's call with Omar.
We can also see the amassing of Israeli tanks in the area, which are positioned at strategic locations, such as the intersections of roads, so that they have lines of sight along the main avenues and streets in the area.
Crucial to the analysis is the short call between Omar and Layan.
We hear a total of 64 gunshots fired in just 6 seconds.
What we heard on the phone call, is there any evidence of any kind of crossfire in the area?
No, what we're hearing are 64 gunshots that are all similar in characteristics, similar in loudness. The gunshots were happening roughly 74 milliseconds apart. This meant that the gun firing these shots was firing around 750 to 900 rounds per minute, which is in excess of what an AK-47 or a Kalashnikov will fire, which are the most common assault rifles attributed to Hamas. This range is consistent with Israeli army weaponry, such as the M4 rifle or the FN Mag machine gun on a Merkava tank. We can derive that for the shortest interval of 24 milliseconds, the shooter had to be 13 meters away from the phone, and with the maximum interval that we hear, which is 40 milliseconds, the shooter has to be 23 meters away from the phone.
It puts us within a kind of ring around the Kia that's between 13 and 23 meters.
Based off that range from the sound analysis, combined with satellite imagery and photos of the area around the car and gas station, they were also able to examine where the shooting could have come from.
We marked all of the bullet holes that we could see from those images. There are holes which appear to be exit holes, so larger openings that are flared, that we witness more on one side of the car than the other. So this gives us a kind of general direction as to the direction of fire. So there's one very distinct line of bullets that we can see at the back, the rear right-hand side of the car, which is a volley of about 30 or so bullets. Well, remember at the end of Fabio's analysis, we saw this ring. And what we're able to do is to superimpose this ring onto the site of the killing. And so we situate the 3D model of the car inside of the site, and we position it in its resting position outside the gas station. And we're also able to model the Merkava tank, and we're able to direct the weapons on the tank towards the car. And this is important because it allows us to draw a line between the guns on the tank and the entry holes that we see on the Kia. So based on positioning the tank in hundreds of places within that ring of 13 to 23 meters, we find that there's a position immediately to the south of the Kia, which appears to be the most likely position of the shooter for this recording.
So from what you've assessed of the Israeli tank position, at that distance, is it likely the Israeli soldiers would have been able to see who was in the car?
We think that it's very likely that they would have been able to see who was in the car, because we know that these tanks are fitted with optical equipment which allows them to see for many kilometers. So yeah, it seems very likely that whatever was going on in the car 13 meters away would have been easily visible.
Footage taken by rescue workers and journalists on February 10th and 11th also showed at least 2 different fragments from 120mm artillery shells, including this one made in the US. Due to the possibility of shelling in the area before and after the attack, it's difficult to confirm if these were from the munitions that hit the ambulance. But it appears to have been hit head-on, burning through the front and middle and pushing the vehicle back.
So there's a likely scenario that the anti-tank missile went through the front of the ambulance and then exited through the back and then pushed the ambulance backwards, as indicated by the markings that we can see on the road.
Hind Rajab's case, a 6-year-old child pleading for her life, shocked the world. When the State Department was asked about it, a spokesperson deferred to the Israeli military.
We have asked the Israeli authorities to investigate this incident on an urgent basis. We understand that they are doing so. We expect to see those results on a timely fashion, and they should include accountability measures as appropriate.
I want to ask you about the case of Hind Rajab. Shouldn't the US itself be conducting its own investigations instead of just relying on Israel to investigate itself?
This is one of many very, very troubling reports that needs to be investigated in an objective way. And I do not think that the United States should rely solely on the information that's provided to the US government by the Netanyahu government regarding these allegations, whether it be in this particular case or many other cases.
Under Biden's own arms transfer policy, the administration is supposed to ensure that its weapons are used in accordance with international law. But 3 months in, when more than 22,000 people have been killed in Gaza, White House officials made it clear they weren't looking into possible violations.
Have you taken any action to this day to assess whether Israel is following the rules of war or not?
I am not aware of any kind of formal assessment being done by the United States government to analyze the compliance with international law by our partner, Israel.
Why not? And how can you be sure then that the weapons and resources that the U.S. is supplying is under those guidelines?
I would just tell you that we have not seen anything that would convince us that we need to take a different approach in terms of trying to help Israel defend itself.
I think it's hard to overstate the extent to which here in Washington it's easy to throw international law out the window and pretend it doesn't matter. The purpose is simultaneously to maintain this idea that the US and Israel are operating in line with international and US law. And the second is to sort of undercut other calls for probes and accountability, right? To undercut the ICJ case, to undercut a potential Geneva Conventions conference.
Kids in Gaza are now dying from the deliberate withholding of food. In addition to the horror of that news, one other thing is true. That is a war crime. It is a textbook war crime.
As the civilian death toll continued to rise and starvation was spreading, some Democrats in the Senate began to push the White House to take steps to assess if U.S. weapons were being used by Israel in violation of international law.
The Biden administration needs to more effectively use the levers of U.S. influence. We've had this pattern for a long time where the President of the United States makes reasonable demands of the Netanyahu government that the Netanyahu government then mostly ignores, and that nevertheless the United States sends 2,000-pound bombs.
In addition to Hind's case, there were numerous incidents that raised questions about the United States' continued support. Like this one, when Israeli forces opened fire on Palestinians desperately trying to get food, killing more than 100 people. And here, where footage shows Israeli forces targeting unarmed civilians in Khan Yunis. Despite seeing attacks like this, by April, it was not clear how thoroughly the administration was assessing possible violations of international law.
We continue to look at incidents as they occur. The State Department has a process in place. And to date, as you and I are speaking, they have not found any incidents where the Israelis have violated international humanitarian law.
They know that those weapons are used in the commission of war crimes, including the deliberate targeting of civilians. Amnesty has provided evidence that the US administration has not rejected and has not denied. What are we to conclude from the US position here? That they tolerate the deliberate killings of Palestinian civilians?
It's not just about following international law, though. There's also a key domestic human rights law that hasn't been enforced: the Leahy Law. It prohibits assistance to foreign military units that commit abuses.
For most countries, before we provide the assistance to a unit, we vet that unit for potential human rights violations. In the case of Israel, we provide the assistance first, and then essentially we keep an ear out for potential allegations of gross violations of human rights. To date, that process has never resulted in a unit of the Israeli security forces being sanctioned by the US, despite very credible allegations of gross violations of human rights, including extrajudicial killings, torture, forced disappearances and rape by Israeli security forces.
In April, the administration said they found credible evidence that specific Israeli units committed abuses before October 7th, but that they would not suspend aid because they believed that the Israeli government had taken steps to deal with the violations. Do you think that lack of enforcement could have an impact on the conduct of Israeli military units if their top arms supplier isn't enforcing accountability mechanisms?
Well, this is why I've said all along that the United States needs to apply its laws uniformly, whether we're dealing with an adversary or whether we're dealing with a friend, because the credibility of U.S. foreign policy requires that we apply our laws on a uniform basis. So, yes, it's very concerning and alarming when we get reports that that is not happening.
We found gross violations of human rights committed by individuals in 5 different units. When it comes to the Leahy Law that you referenced, a critical part of that law is seeing appropriate remediation when...
When I talk to current US officials, they say, why should we be concerned? No one's going to arrest us. There's no accountability. So there is a culture of impunity within Israel that we have encouraged through not enforcing our own laws. And there is a culture of impunity in our own system that we have encouraged by not enforcing our own laws.
Secretary Blinken, a question from Al Jazeera. What is your message to the families of Palestinian civilians who were killed with U.S. weapons in Gaza? Why is your administration not enforcing U.S. and international law to hold Israel accountable?
Throughout the war, there were numerous allegations of human rights violations by Israeli forces. After surviving the airstrike that killed dozens of their relatives, Hiba and her family moved to another building in mid-December. At the same time, Israeli ground forces had encircled the north.
ولجأنا لإله بدنا نحتمي فيه وصارت مجزرة تانية في العمارة كلها. دبابات على باب البيت كانت محصرانة والجرافات، وقعدنا أسبوع كامل وهي القذائف تنزل على العمارة اللي إحنا كنا فيها ومحاصرين، والطخم الكوادكابتر شغال 24 ساعة علينا كان. يعني كنا عايشين أوضاع صعبة جداً جداً جداً، وما في مية وما في أي حياة كانت عندنا.
Another woman staying in the building, who wanted to remain anonymous out of fear for her safety, confirmed the days-long attack.
لو في أي إشي بخوفهم أو أي إشي بضر فيهم أو أي حدا قومهم مبدئيا في ال5 أيام هم عارفين إن البيت هذا فيه مدنيين.
Satellite imagery from the morning of December 19th shows Israeli tanks about 1 block away from the apartment building. That afternoon, the family says Israeli soldiers came to their door.
وب19 الشهر 19/12 إجت القوة الخاصة فاتت العمارة.
طلعوا كل شقة طبعاً بيطلقوا نار وقذائف على كل شقة عشان يفتحوها يفتشوها ويعرفوا من فيها طبعاً كل مدنيين اللي كانوا بالبيت هنا.
صاروا يحكوا في عندكم مقاومين، حكينا لهم ما في عندنا أي حد من المقاومين، كلهيتنا مدنيين وكله عندي أطفال. أخذوا ابني الشاب على المطبخ وصاروا يضربوا فيه، بلشوا يضربوا فيه ببطنه وفي راسه.
ضربوا أبوي دبوه عن الدرج ورجع قال له اسجد هنا اركع.
There was another family in the building that day, the Anans and their in-laws.
رفعنا ايدينا ايش لها وعيش احنا وعينا. مسكوا البنت بنتي وابنها طفل صغير يعني يمكن 8 سنين أو 9 سنوات. قالوا له اطلع. صار تطلع فينا كده رعب وخوف، شفت الخوف في عينيه. واحنا ظلنا قاعدين عريانين في عز البرد. أطفال ياخذوا ولد من أولاد يضربوه، خذوه في زاوية من الزوايا. بعد قال له قوم خذهم وانزل. بقول له وين؟ بقول له على اليم على البحر. طب أنا عارف إنه أولادي فوق وبقية العيلة فوق، طب إيش بدي أسوي فيهم؟
Ahmed says he was forced to leave while the rest of his family was upstairs, including his son Yahya.
أول ما خشوا قلنا بصوت واحد إحنا مدنيين مدنيين مدنيين. خشوا طخ عشوائي. أول واحد استشهد زي ما أنت شايف أبو حمدي الغاليين جوز أختي، هذه عبايته رحمة الله عليه هاي دم. طخوه طلق في راسه والثاني في قلبه. الجنود كانوا هان، طبعا شي بيتكلم عبري شي بيتكلم انجلش، بيحكوا مع بعض لأنه يعني جيش نظامي هذا. بس طبعا لا سؤال ولا ايش اسمك ولا رقم هويتك ولا أي إشي.
بعد ما دخلوا عنا الجنود توصلونا، عزلوا الرجال لحال والنساء لحال والأطفال. بعد ما طبعا عزلونا إحنا النساء والأطفال بدأوا طبعا بالشتم الغلط.
كانت معهم مهدة كبيرة كانوا يخبطوا فيها عند راسنا وطخوا فوق راسنا بالضبط طلق، يعني خلى دينينا تصير بالمرة حالتنا، واخدونا اقتدونا بنساء ثلاثة على غرفة داخلية. طبعا جردونا من ملابسنا وفتشونا وهم بتصهونوا وبيضحكوا وبيغلطوا علينا بالكلام الوسخ.
The women had been separated from the men, but Hiba says they could see them from where they were.
عذبوهم واحنا قاعدين نتفرج عليهم. كسروا فك جوزي، كسروا له هاي الجهة كلها صار عنده نزيف، عذبوه على ايديهم يخبطوا فيه في الكلاشينات على ايديه لحد ما ايدين جوزي كلهم صاروا دم يسيلوا، وابني كذلك كسروا له كل جسمه. بعد كده بلشوا طبعا شلحهم كل هدومهم بس بالبوكسرات وخلوهم يناموا كده على الأرض.
The survivors say the Israeli soldiers then executed the men in front of them.
بلشوا في الإعدامات قدام عينينا كنا، ما خلوا ولا حد، يعني عملوا ساحة دم قسماً بعزة الله يوم ما بنتسى ولا حينتسى.
At least 11 men were killed, including Hiba's husband, Ayman. Yahya and Odeh were both injured and passed out, but they survived.
في شخص جنبي اجى بده يقف، يعني بده يطلع، صار اطلاق نار بشكل مش طبيعي عليه. طبعا انا كان غير التعذيب اللي عذبونا اياه، من كتر التعذيب كان مغمى علي.
كلت طبعا باقي البلاتين، كلت الطلقين، اغمى علي. أكون بين لحظة والثانية بين الموت، فإيش ما بدي أحكي لك، إيش ما بدي أشرح لك، مش هتكون بنفس الشعور اللي أنا عشته. يعني هذا من أسوأ أيام حياتي. بس
According to survivors, after the executions, the soldiers left but were still outside the building.
أنا لما أخذت أختي ندى في حضني قعدنا الشقة اللي قبال الشباك. في هذا الوقت قعدنا شوي، بعد يمكن تقريباً 3 دقائق بدأوا يرموا القذائف. خلص القذائف لما بدت الكواد الطخ صوتها انقطع. بعرفش إنه هي استشهدت يعني.
جتها شظية في عينها وهي مفتحة، بنتي استشهدت وهي قاعدة بتطلع.
Nada was 4 years old.
وهذا بلوزتها إنه الذكرى تمتها منها إلنا.
After the soldiers left, the survivors tried to get help. Fault lines reviewed text messages sent by survivors that night. One of Yahya's sisters who survived the attack messaged a group chat that included relatives, telling them what happened. And then one of Yahya's brothers, who was outside of Gaza, sent a voice note pleading for someone to find a way to help his family.
أي واحد، أي إسعاف، صليب أحمر، أي حد يروح عندهم، بدهم يخلوا بس يطلعوا من الدار، مش عارفين يطلعوا، واقفين على باب الدار اليهود.
The next day, people were able to enter the building. Fault lines obtained 2 videos of the aftermath of the scene, including this one. It was taken the day after by a neighbor. The bodies of several undressed men can be seen here, surrounded by blood and bullet-ridden walls. And Yahya, alive, is seen for a brief moment. After this, survivors were taken to the hospital as seen in this Al Jazeera report. This is Yahya.
أول واحد لطشوه جوز أختي أبو حمدي طخوه وهو بيقول له مدنيين.
Hiba and her children were filmed as well.
أنا في إيدي رصاصة، بنتي في راسها رصاصة، ابني بطل يشوف بنتي الصغيرة استشهدت، جوزي عدم.
A video taken just before Hiba's husband Ayman was buried shows the injuries on his face.
معهم كل الإمكانيات وأنت مدني أعزل لا تملك إشي وما سويت حاجة وبلحظة إنه ينعدم أغلب قرايبك. عمي وابن عمي وكان جوز أختي من نار العشري وكان في برضه اللي هو ولاد أختي اللي هو أولاد الشهيد مستشهد فيهم. فقدت أنا أخويا أمين الله يرحمه أكبر مني بسنتين، ما له أي دعوة لا في مقاومة ولا بضرب طلب. ما ظنيت إن في بني آدم يعني ممكن ينسى موقف زي هيك.
The Israeli military did not reply to questions regarding the attack. We've spoken to civilians in Gaza who say that Israeli troops came into their place of residence or where they were sheltering. They separated the men and women and executed the men. Shouldn't this trigger an investigation by the US?
Yes, it absolutely should. And I think also relates to the question of Leahy vetting. Had we, for the last decade, 2 decades, been applying the law as it is written, would we still be seeing some of these atrocities by Israeli forces? And certainly would we still be seeing these TikTok videos being made of IDF soldiers documenting their own war crimes? I think it is the lack of culpability that we've provided Israel for decades that has created a culture of impunity within the IDF that has facilitated a lot of these crimes.
In May, after being pushed by Senate Democrats, the White House issued a report to Congress, which said that it was likely that US weapons had been used by Israel in violation of international humanitarian law, but that they couldn't be sure.
The United States will always ensure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself.
As Israeli ground troops began to enter Rafah in May, the Biden administration submitted a new weapons package for Israel to Congress. And by the end of the month, Israel escalated its bombardment of Rafah, where Palestinians had been told they would be safe.
Do we have memory? Does the world have memory? I will remember the United States as having allowed for the commission of the worst possible crimes against Palestinians. I will remember the United States as having failed in their obligations to prevent those crimes through their very powerful position in the world and vis-à-vis Israel.
طلعت الشحن.
اياد كان كل العابه لما يشتريها يشتري العاب اطفال، يشتري سياره، يشتري مسدس، يشتري دباديب، يشتري اشياء اطفال. اياد الان ايش بيشتري؟ بيشتري عروسه إلها كروسه بصير يمشي فيها وبيحكي لها يلا يا هنود امشي. امسك العروسه نامي يا هنود. لما انا بكون حضناه برضاش والله اورجي دموعي، كان بيقول أنا حاسك بتعيطي، أما أنا ما تعيطي. بقول لي أنت يا ماما قوية، مش هنود قالت لك أنت يا ماما قوية.
يعني بتقتلوش، انتوا بتبعتوا سلاح يا ناس اطفال، حرام عليكم ارحمونا. انتوا الحزب عندكم قانون، عنده انسانيه وعنده ديمقراطيه، وين الديمقراطيه اللي عندكم؟ وين القانون اللي عندكم؟
We wanted to speak with the White House and State Department to discuss the administration's role in the war, but they declined repeated interview requests.
في هاي الحرب أنا فقدت أكثر ناس مقربة لقلبي، طبعاً جوزي، نور عيوني، بنتي، نبض قلبي، أغلى الناس إلي أنا فقدتهم وراحوا. كل ما أتذكرهم قلبي للأمانة بنحرق. صارت فيهم تهجير، صارت فيهم مجازر، صارت فيهم منهم بالآلاف يطلعوا يمشوا ويتهجروا. فيش مكان آمن، فيش مكان إنه الواحد يروح يخلي فيه.
It could take 80 years to rebuild Gaza, according to the UN. But the war hasn't just destroyed Gaza. It's upended the system of international laws that was supposed to prevent these types of atrocities from happening.
The rules that were supposed to bind us together, to prevent the worst from happening, to prevent us from committing the worst on others because we are capable of doing it, those rules are no longer applicable. And once you justify the violations of those rules, you are basically saying the rules are no longer applicable. And everything we created after World War II, that's up for rewriting. And trust me, it will not just be the United States and their allies who are going to do that. They have opened the door to hell.
عمري ما حسيت إنه القوانين الدولية أو المؤسسات الدولية أو مؤسسات الحقوق إنها عملت إشي لقطاع غزة، كلام حبر على ورق. لحموا مسعفين، لحموا صحفيين، لحموا أطفال، لحموا مدنيين. هند وليان وعمي وزوجته وأولاده تم إعدامهم بدم بارد.
What makes it more difficult for me, is it only Hind? Is there another 1,000 Hind story? 10,000 Hind stories that did not have a name and a story on the TV, on the news, was not spread?
عائلة كاملة تم إعدامها، يعني تم محوها من السجل المدني وكأنها يعني لم تكن في التاريخ، مع إنه إلهم أحباب وإلهم ناس بتستناهم كانت وناس بتحبهم.
العالم كله ما هم شايفين إيه بصير بغزة، يعني وقتها بدهم ضلهم هيك عاملين فينا، معييتهم في الأطفال.
كل الحيطان مكسرة، حرقوا قلوبنا، دمرونا، كل اللي حوالينا علقنا. ربنا يصبرنا إن شاء الله. إنا الله وإنا إليه راجعون. هذا كل اللي بقدر أقوله، غير هيك فيش شيء بقدر أقوله.
That was The Night Won't End, the incredibly powerful documentary produced by Al Jazeera's investigative documentary program, Fault Lines. And we're really honored to have the executive producer of Fault Lines and of this film, Laila Al-Arian, as well as the correspondent on the film, Sharif Abdel Kouddous, with us now for a discussion. I just want to say, I think this is probably the 10th or 12th time that I've watched this film. I wasn't even planning on watching it because I've seen it many times, but I just watched it again. And each time I watch it, I just am struck by the thought. And I saw that many of you who are watching posted comments to this effect. You know, I think everyone should see this film. And I think it's an incredible tool that I'm really grateful that the whole team, especially the brave journalists, the camera people, and others on the ground in Gaza who made this film. And it is devastating and painful, but it's also, as a film, beautiful. And that's why I think it's so important that people show this film to anyone in your ordinary life, in your day-to-day life, that you feel just doesn't understand what's happening. I think it's an incredibly powerful film that has the ability to transform hearts, and that's a real tribute to the work that Sharif and Laila and the whole team that worked on this did. I mean, I had the honor of talking a lot to Laila as they were making this film, and she would tell me these stories about what they were hearing, not just from the subjects, the people whose stories are featured in the film, but also their colleagues who risked their lives in Gaza to make this film. And let's remember that more than 160 of our colleagues have been, I say murdered in Gaza, journalists, because it's been like a killing spree that the Israelis have gone on targeting journalists and their family members. And, you know, this was a film produced for Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera has lost so many journalists. And, you know, I think it's shameful that more American and Western journalists have not used their platforms to denounce this mass crime against journalists, against the landscape of a horrifying genocide against an entire entrapped civilian population in Gaza. So first, just gratitude on behalf of all of us. And I know I speak for the subscribers of Drop Site News because we see their comments, and thanking you both for making this film. Sharif, I wanted to begin with you. We'll talk about the film, but I just very briefly wanted you to share with people your latest article for Drop Site News, and it deals with the most recent statistics that have been released by the Ministry of Health in Gaza, tracking the number of Palestinians that have been killed since Israel launched its onslaught in October.
Yeah, so just a couple of days ago, I mean, the Ministry of Health in Gaza, I think, needs to be studied as a testament to resilience and to the importance of documentation, because I think they understand, Palestinians understand more than anyone else, how their stories are skewed, how they're dehumanized. And so the Ministry of Health in Gaza has done this kind of incredible work of documenting. They put out a daily news bulletin every single day of the number of Palestinians killed that they can confirm, and the number of wounded. And a few times since October 7th, maybe just 4 times, they've put out a list with the names, the dates of birth, the ID numbers of everyone who's killed. And that last one came out just a couple of days ago. It included the names of over 34,000 Palestinians who have been killed. There was over 40, this is between October 7th and August 31st. The ministry had confirmed over 40,000 dead during that period, but it only could gather, I say only, it only could gather the information for 34,000 of them. And this list, it was 649 pages, this PDF that they released. And you know, just looking at it, you know, first of all, when we talk about, there's something dehumanizing about numbers, and they're cold and they're numbing. And I think it's sometimes problematic the way we speak about Palestinian casualties in just numbers. In fact, Sharif Abdel Kouddous, the poet and mentor for so many, co-founded a group called We Are Not Numbers, allowing Palestinians to tell their stories. But the data is important because it does tell its own story. And what we found just by looking at the ages, the first 14 pages of this was organized by age. The age was 0, and these were Palestinian babies who had been killed before they reached their first birthday, and there was 710 names. That's the equivalent of 2 babies under 1-year-old being killed by Israel every day for nearly a year. And so, that's a shocking statistic. And we went through the numbers a bit more, and, toddlers 1 to 3, there's over 1,700 were killed. That's the rate of killing children who are between 1 and 3 years old, 5 of them a day for nearly a year. Children between 4 and 12 killing 16 a day, 5,400 of them. So, as I said, we don't hear the stories of all of these human beings. Each one of them is a universe, but and these numbers are often then disputed by Israeli authorities. President Biden himself, the first time they put out such a list was less than 3 weeks into the war, when over 7,000 Palestinians have been killed. And President Biden, in a press conference in the Rose Garden, questioned the number of Palestinians who have been killed. And less than 24 hours later, the health ministry put out its list with all the names, with the ID numbers that are registered with Israel. And so I think it's a testament to being able to do this, where you have a healthcare system where over half of the hospitals have been completely shut down and destroyed from the Israeli assault. 15 are partially functioning, mass displacement. And somehow they managed to continue to document this. And I think it's a testament to resilience to tell their stories and to record memory.
Laila, I wanted to also ask you, as you were making this, of course, you are Palestinian. Your parents are also descendants of the Nakba, the state of Israel's creation on the corpses, lives, land of the Palestinian people. What was it like for you as you were making this film and you were immersed every day with the experience of your team on the ground inside of Gaza, and also, I feel shocked to even say this, but people should understand that more than 200 members of Laila's mother's extended family have been killed in Gaza since October. Let that set in for a second. The journalist that we're talking to right now, her mother's family, 200 members killed during the course of less than a year. Imagine what that would be in your life. It's like all of your cousins and their wives and their children just wiped out. And Laila, somehow you get up every day and you do this work and you're immersed in it. Talk about that.
I actually just found out on early September that another relative of my mother's, Anas Shaladan, was killed on September 2nd. Anas was 16 years old and he was killed on his 16th birthday. He had left the family home or where they were sheltering. Of course, we know that families in Gaza have been displaced sometimes up to 10 times. So imagine being chased by Israeli bombardments and attacks over and over again and trying to find shelter and trying to find safety, only to find out, as you saw in the film, with the Al-Ghaf family, with Hind's family, with the Salem family, that there's no safety anywhere in Gaza. So Anas and his father were walking, and an Israeli drone basically bombed them as they were walking to go to their previous home to retrieve some items. Anas was killed, his father was injured. And when I looked to see whether there'd been any media coverage of this attack, I saw just a very small headline. I had to actually search Telegram, some of the Telegram channels to find that headline. So it shows you that there's a number of deaths that are happening, a number of killings that aren't even being recorded. That's despite the very valiant, courageous efforts that Sharif talked about from the Ministry of Health, from journalists on the ground who are doing this work, despite the risks to their safety, to their freedom, to their family's safety. So it's just very concerning the sheer numbers we're talking about and the fact that many deaths perhaps are going unrecorded. As far as what it was like making this film as a Palestinian, I mean, I think in many ways, the distress, the sadness I feel, the trauma that we've all been experiencing and exposed to is as upsetting to me, whether it's a member of my family or any other family. I remember one day it was sort of surreal, kind of living our lives as Americans in the safety. And I was actually at my children's martial arts lesson, and I was just transcribing and translating the interview with Uday, talking about what happened to his father before his father's execution. And there was this detail of him being pushed down the stairs, even though everything they experienced that day, you know, the beatings, the punching, of course, the execution, everything was so horrifying. But there was something about the power dynamic of these Israeli soldiers coming into their home, forcing this, you know, this man who we found his Facebook page. I mean, before all of this, he was living a normal life. He was, you know, happy with his family, making him go upstairs, knock on his neighbor's door, you know, say something to get them to come out. And then after he'd done what they told him to do at gunpoint, they pushed him down the stairs. And you can even see, you know, we got access to the video of him as he was being buried, the injuries to his face when he was punched. So, you know, and I was just sobbing listening to this, just how dehumanizing, how humiliating, how everything the Israeli military does is intended to dehumanize, humiliate, beat down the Palestinian people, how really every Palestinian is viewed as fair game, as a target for their genocidal acts.
I also want to note that we had thousands of people that RSVP'd to this and that have written to us also to say that they went and then watched the film on Al Jazeera's website, on YouTube, and you know, we had 1,300 people stay on this stream for this whole film. And if you imagine being in a theater with 1,300 people, those are all people who can tell others about this film. And so I want to just remind people that if you've been struggling and wanting to know what can you do, one small step that you can take is to send this incredible piece of investigative journalism. I think one of the most important pieces of journalism produced about this genocide. Send it to people that are in your everyday life or in your extended family or people that you've been arguing with, and just say, hey, just take an hour and 20 minutes, and then we can talk about this. You know, because I think in the end, it's you have to reach people in their heart and to remember these are human beings whose lives are being shredded to pieces. And as Sharif was mentioning, I mean, so many children. I just read a statistic today also that 11,000 students are estimated to have been killed in the past 11 months alone. I mean, you know, imagine that as our children go back to school right now, as universities reopen, 11,000 students. Sharif mentioned Rafat Al-Arian. You know, how many academics and intellectuals and authors and poets and artists have been killed? It's you know, and we talk about, you know, people from our profession. And Sharif, I wanted to ask you, and Laila, you can also weigh in on this as well. You know, Sharif, you're in touch regularly with journalists on the ground in Gaza. You know some of the journalists who have been killed in Gaza. Recently, we got a voice note from Anas al-Sharif, who is one of the best known Al Jazeera Arabic correspondents on the ground in Gaza, describing what it's like to be a journalist, what it's like to be a journalist in Gaza. Remember, too, these are not journalists that parachuted in from the outside or have an escape hatch, you know, or someone that's going to evacuate them when things get bad. This happened in the place where they lived. And so, Sharif, maybe talk about what Anas al-Sharif, a very courageous journalist, one of the primary people who is showing the world what is happening. He's in the north of Gaza, which is where there's just been an intense, merciless campaign, not just militarily, but also of starvation. But talk about journalism on the ground, Anas al-Sharif, and perhaps Laila, also you can talk about the crew that made this film on the ground and what they went through as they were making it.
Yeah, Anas has really become the face
for so many of how they see this genocide. He's the main correspondent in the north for Al Jazeera. He's one of the very few correspondents few journalists who never left the north since the beginning. There's about 30 journalists left. He describes how in November, this was documented at the time, he began receiving calls from Israeli military officials on his cell phone telling him to cease coverage from the north and to displace to the south. He refused. He received WhatsApp messages with his location as a threat. He again refused and put out a video saying, "I will not leave. I will continue my coverage." Less than 3 weeks later, his family home in the Jabalia refugee camp in western Gaza City was bombed. His 90-year-old father, who was one of the few in the family who couldn't leave, was killed. And he's just seen so many of his colleagues die in front of him. He describes being displaced 20 times, sleeping in cars, sleeping on roads, sleeping on highways, going days without having food, having to risk death day after day, but also climbing tall buildings to try and get a signal, a cell phone signal, because communications have been cut, in order to send a low quality image. And he continues to do this day after day. And he told us, one part I found very moving. He said, despite all this hardship, despite all this suffering, he said, maybe the world won't act, maybe the world won't help us. But every time I document a massacre or an event or a bombing, I think that maybe through this bombing or through this image that the war can stop and the war could end. And this is what drives us to continue our coverage to the end. And it's such a strong sentiment from someone who believes truly in the power of exposing what's happening. The sad reality is this is not headline news every day. We should be getting breaking news alerts on our phone all the time, but we don't. And it just continues to happen. As you mentioned, Jeremy, it's by some counts, over 160 journalists have been killed. That's a journalist being killed every other day in Gaza for nearly a year. This is unprecedented. This is a level of killing of the media that we've never seen in modern history. And we dedicated our film to all the journalists in Gaza, and to particularly our colleagues who lost their lives, who were killed, Samir Abu Da'a, Hamza Dahdouh, and Mustafa Thuraya. Since this film has come out, another Al Jazeera correspondent was killed, Ismail Al-Ghul, along with his cameraman, Rami Al-Rifi. On July 31st, the Israeli military struck their car with a drone strike. Ismail was decapitated, and he was killed. He was very, very close to Anas al-Sharif, a very close friend of his Al Jazeera colleague. They afterwards, all the journalists took off their press vests and threw it on the ground in protest and said, "This is the symbol that's supposed to protect us. This is the symbol of the media." And the stories just keep going on. In August last month, Israel killed another journalist, Hamza Murtaja. He was the brother of Yasser Murtaja. Yasser Murtaja was a journalist who was killed in 2018 by an Israeli sniper during the Great Marches of Return. Yasser Murtaja founded an award-winning media group called Ain Media with Rushdie Sarraj. Rushdie Sarraj killed in October in an airstrike on his home as he stood in front of his wife and daughter, and they survived. His wife, Shuru Alia, took over Ain Media and is now reporting. And she describes how when now she goes up to people wearing her press jacket, they get scared of her because journalists are targets. And so this is this unbelievable environment that they're operating in, and it's not being acknowledged by Western media outlets in the way that it needs to be. There's been a massive failure, a shameful lack of solidarity with their colleagues. These are their colleagues. And this is not a danger just to Palestinian journalists or Arab journalists. This is a danger to journalists around the world, and it continues to happen.
Laila, go ahead and weigh in on the same.
No, I'm very grateful to Sharif's work. You can read his piece on Anas al-Sharif on Dropsite News' website. I remember watching Ismail Al-Ghul on July 31st because that was also the day that Israel assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, the political head of Hamas in Iran. And I just remember watching Ismail in front of Hania's home in a refugee camp in Gaza, and just looking at his face and thinking, wow, he just looks, he had like a, he was young. He was what, 28, 29. He's very young. And just thinking he's still young, and yet he's seen so much in the last, at that point it was what, 9-10 months. It was just, I know that we shouldn't be surprised given that Israel has set so many records, whether it's the killing of children, which we've talked about, the killing and targeting of journalists, the targeting of hospitals, of schools and universities and mosques. But it still shocked me that they would kill him in that way while he was, in a car marked press. The way that they also targeted Wael al-Dahdouh, Hamza's father. Sharif talked about Hamza. Wael was reporting after an airstrike with his colleagues, Samer Abu Da'a, and they had actually gotten permission, or they had cleared with the Israeli military their coordinates that they were going to the site of the strike to do their job as journalists, and yet they were attacked, and Samer was left to bleed to death for 5 hours. So, and of course, Sharif and I and our colleague Kavitha Shakuru also reported on the killing of Shireen Abu Aqla, a U.S. citizen, who was a Palestinian journalist, very legendary Al Jazeera journalist, back in May of 2022. So this didn't start with the war on Gaza in the last year. And I echo what Sharif said about just the complete shameful lack of solidarity within the Western media, within the industry. As far as the crew that worked on this, it was a production company called Media Town. The head of it is Ashraf Mashharawi, and he's currently not in Gaza, but from there, grew up there. And he has just a tremendously talented group of journalists working, many of them in the north, on the ground in Gaza, who filmed for our film and who worked under conditions of starvation, frankly. I remember one night, Bilal Salim, one of the journalists who worked on this film, saying, we all, 10 of us men shared 1 can of beans for dinner. So they were working in conditions of starvation. Just getting around Gaza, being able to do this reporting was extremely tough. One of the directors of photography actually didn't have his camera because his camera had been destroyed by Israel earlier in the war and had to use his iPhone. So, and just physically, being able to send us the material was very challenging. So, just their professionalism, their resilience, their perseverance, their courage, we can't say enough about that.
And let me just add one more thing, Jeremy, about the crew that worked with us. One of them, a very talented DP, a videographer called Abdel Kouddous who had worked with AP and CNN and and BBC and other major outlets, and was instrumental in this documentary. I was having trouble getting in touch with Anas Sharif. I called him several times. I left voice notes for him. Obviously, very, very busy. I didn't have a connection with him before. So I contacted Abdul Qadir, and he's the one who actually got us that interview. But Abdul Qadir himself, and I think something we have to understand is the targeting of journalists, Israel's not even, as it usually does in the past, denying that it's doing this. Not always. It admits it. It said, we killed them because they're Hamas. Hamza al-Dahdouh they said he was a Hamas operative and put out this. And so then every Wire story then echoes this claim uncritically. And what's happening with Abdel Qadir Sabbah is that he's being subject to a smear campaign by this pro-Israel media group called Honest Reporting that has, launched a campaign against him, claiming he's linked to Hamas. CNN then dropped him based on that. So then other major outlets dropped him. He can't find work. Everything's extremely expensive in Gaza right now. And this is another way that they're being targeted, and it's unbelievable that this is allowed to happen, and that an outlet like CNN is directly putting him in danger by dropping him, according to those claims, linking him to Hamas. That makes it much easier for Israel to kill him. So it's shameful.
I want to ask you some questions that we've gotten from viewers and from readers, and I'll take 2 at once here because they're related to each other, and either of you can jump in here. One of them is from George Coravilla. He says, is there any way we can help make this documentary get such a release in theaters? How can we counter all this hate and misinformation with this? What can we do to help? So maybe Laila, you could take that.
Sure. Well, we're very grateful, that you all organize this screening. There've also been screenings all over the world, in Sydney, in Istanbul, in Chicago during the DNC, in Dearborn, Michigan, which has the largest Arab American community in the United States. So we're really grateful that people really have been screening this film. We encourage people to hold public screenings as much as they can. I think it's especially timely before the election, given the focus on the Biden administration's role in what's happening in Gaza. So I would just say reach out to me if you want to organize a screening in your community, and I'll work with Al Jazeera to get the permissions. But the important thing is to make sure they're well attended, which takes time and effort, and just making sure you all spread the word to your communities and make sure that seats are filled in wherever you screen them.
And again, you can also send the link around to people. It got age restricted when it was soon after it came out on YouTube, which is a tactic that is used to try to suppress views, because it requires people then to have to sign in to affirm their age, to put in even more data into the system. We also recently saw our colleagues from Electronic Intifada, their YouTube feed, and they do a very important regular show. Ali Abu Nima, Nora Barrows-Friedman, and their colleagues do an extremely important program where they're documenting in extensive detail developments out of Gaza. They have local reporters and residents from Gaza regularly featured, and they moments before they were going to go live some days ago, they got a shutdown order from YouTube, saying that their broadcasting was going to be suspended for a period of time. And in fact, Ali Abu Nima, who I've known for decades, he recently had an issue in Germany where he was invited to remotely give a speech, and moments before it was set to start, he was served with legal papers threatening him. He hadn't even spoken a word yet. And we've dealt with censorship also in our short life at Dropsite News. The Pakistani government banned us. They went after us. They threatened to sue us. Meta has censored us. But I will say the people who are the greatest victims of censorship here are Palestinians, and the greatest victims of cancel culture, even before people talked about cancel culture, often were professors, academics, people who were speaking out in defense of Palestinians. I want to read another question from Saad, who asks, and Sharif, I'll throw this to you first. In your estimation, what is the best strategy as citizens here to get the U.S. to stop supporting genocide?
I mean, there's an election coming up, a presidential election, and we're in this unfortunate position where both candidates are trying to outdo each other in their support for Israel. I went to the DNC in Chicago and was still shocked by what the Democrats did and what the Harris campaign did, because there was about 30 delegates representing the uncommitted movement. And this was, if people don't know, during the primaries, a way to vote uncommitted during the primary, which voting instead for not Biden at the time, voting uncommitted to voice dissatisfaction and for U.S. backing of Israel. So these delegates then were representing hundreds of thousands of voters actually at the DNC. And they requested the Harris campaign and the DNC to be able to address the convention from the stage. They gave a list of Palestinian Americans who could speak, and they allowed the DNC to vet the speech. Okay, this wasn't some, taking down of the Biden administration, but acknowledging the level of suffering and death and calling for an end to U.S. support. And the Harris campaign, it was the Harris campaign that said no and denied them. So this means that the mere presence of a Palestinian was too much. And of course, people made comparisons of this to 1964 and Fannie Lou Hamer and so forth. But I think people need to contact there has to be a political cost for these for our legislators, for our elected officials, to this continued support for this genocide. And so call your congressman, congress member, petition, and use your vote in a way that I think makes sense. And also I think we need to continue to expose what's happening every day, not become numb to it. I personally have to fight against the normalization of this violence. I feel like a year ago, I'm still outraged and deeply depressed, but I was kind of more outraged or more in a panic back then. And it's somehow every day you see it and you become sort of numb to it. And I think we all have to actively fight against that because people are losing their lives every day and they're being killed. And so, and this war could not, or this genocide could not continue without US backing. It could not continue without, Israel doesn't have to make any tough decisions. It can continue to bomb relentlessly because it keeps getting resupplied. And so that needs to end.
Yeah, and you know, just I mean, one point on this too. I mean, the discourse around this election with Kamala Harris, who repeatedly, she and her advisors make it crystal clear that she fully supports what the Biden administration has done for 11 months. She goes out of her way to frame US military, economic, political, legal support to Israel as entirely about quote unquote self-defense. And, you know, people who are haranguing voters and harassing them because they're not declaring their loyalty to the Democratic Party right now. And I said this many, many months ago, you know, they need to really take a serious look at what's going on inside of their heart and head, because what they're doing is they are blaming people who are desperately trying to do everything they can to stop this, instead of holding the Democratic Party accountable for its doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on support for this genocidal war that Israel is waging. You know, and so, I mean, you know, I don't tell people who to vote for, who not to vote for, but I will stand up for people who are acting on principle and are constantly being told they're going to be responsible for Donald Trump. This is always the Democrats' narrative every election. And the reality is that if people don't want to see a genocide unfold in Gaza, then you hold the politicians accountable that are facilitating that genocide right now. You know, if you give up everything and you say, well, yeah, we know Kamala Harris has been one of the key facilitators of genocide, but we have to vote for her anyway, you're giving up any political authority you have, any political power that you have. This shaming of people needs to stop. If you want to direct your ire somewhere, direct it at the people who are creating a situation where so many feel like they can't in good faith vote for them. Kamala Harris could have come out and set a very different tone. And people say, oh, well, she's vice president. Well, I mean, you can look at U.S. history, and there are moments when the call is clear to stand up and actually break with policy. And there would have been a way for Kamala Harris to thread that needle. She chose not to do it, and her advisors chose not to do it. We have about 10 minutes left here, Laila, and I on that subject, and you can weigh in on any part of this. But we also have another comment from a viewer saying, in America, Harris talks, quote unquote, two-state solution, but we know that's never going to happen. We know it's a lie. We've been lied to for years. What can we do? I mean, you could address part of that, Laila, on the two-state solution or anything else that's come before this.
I mean, I would say educate yourselves as much as possible about how the two-state solution was an illusion, that it never promised Palestinians anything, and it certainly didn't yield anything for Palestinians other than further land theft that was done under the guise of a so-called peace process. Of course, the building of the apartheid wall and the entrenching of settlers on Palestinian land, the rapid expansion of settlements, as well as the entrenchment of the apartheid system and the increasing brutality of the Israeli occupation. And when you talk about increasing brutality of the Israeli occupation, what does that look like? It looks like checkpoints that Palestinians have to go through that are completely dehumanizing. It looks like Jewish-only roads and Palestinian-only roads. It looks like Palestinian lives being controlled in every single way by Israel, Palestinians being basically trapped and jailed in their own towns and villages, not being able to travel, not having freedom of movement. everything, and just educating yourselves, educating your neighbors, your family members. Just today, I heard about an effort by Christians United for Israel to bombard, which is a very pro-Israel Christian Zionist organization, to bombard lawmakers with thousands of emails urging them to continue supporting Israel. So of course, a grassroots movement is needed to counter those efforts. There's a lot of astroturfing and kind of organizations like Sharif mentioned, like Honest Reporting, that whose very existence is to marginalize Palestinian voices. Of course, there's Canary Mission. There's all sorts of organizations that are extremely well funded. And when you look at the last year, what were the moments, the glimmers of hope? It was the grassroots movement. It was the students organizing on campuses, holding these encampments, telling Palestinians in Gaza that they're not forgotten, showing solidarity for them, even though they were risking their futures, their careers, even being able to graduate. Everyone that you talk to, when you say, what was it that gave you hope? It's always the student movement. So let's not discount the power of grassroots organizing, of showing that kind of solidarity. And as Sharif mentioned, let's not get numb to Palestinian suffering, to the killing of Palestinians, because that's what Israel's counting on, that we all get tired, that we look away, that Palestinian death becomes both accepted and expected. And we have to push back against that with every fiber of our being.
We have just a few minutes left, but I also want to say, you know, what we're trying to do, just to give people informally just a sense of some of our ideas at Dropsite News. I mean, one thing that we think has really been missing from so much of the discourse in the English language media or the Western media is the work of Palestinian reporters and local reporters. And one of the reasons why we've brought Sharif on board is not only to write and to report, but also to help coordinate journalists on the ground in Gaza, in the West Bank, in occupied Palestine, writing about what they're seeing and doing journalism. And, you know, some of the best voices and the best journalists on the ground, they're not writing or posting on social media in English. They're working in Arabic. And, you know, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes resources, but we really are committed to trying to develop networks of local reporters, including many who no one in the Western world has ever heard of. And some of them, you know, are very well known in among Arabic language audiences. Others are not, but we have many pieces in the pipeline that we're working on, and we are committed. And it's not just in Palestine. We're also going to look at this more broadly in the region. We're going to report on Egypt. We're going to report on Lebanon. We're going to report on all of the countries in the region. And what we're trying to do is something that we feel has public interest value also in the United States. You know, because journalists on the ground, not the ones that parachute in, are in the best position to inform us about what is going on. I want to give both Laila and Sharif just a moment to give closing thoughts, but I do want to thank all of the people who have donated to Dropsite News, who RSVP'd to this event, and I want to encourage people to share the work that Laila Al-Arian is producing at Fault Lines. I can't talk about what it is, but there's another extremely powerful documentary film coming out in the next week or so. So, you know, you can follow Laila on social media. You can follow AJ Fault Lines as well on social media. Let your friends, your family, your foes, your coworkers, your whole network know that this film exists. And I think it's a really good conversation point with people who may not be as immersed as our readers are on these issues. So I'll leave it now, Sharif, first you, and then Laila to have closing thoughts.
Well, first, I just want to thank both of you. I've worked with both of you over the years, and I feel very lucky to have done so, and I've learned a lot from both of you. And yes, I think places like Fault Lines and places like Dropsite do need to be actively supported, because this is the way these stories get out. And particularly at Dropsite, as Jeremy mentioned, I'm extremely honored and excited to have the work of Palestinian journalists on the ground come directly be published in English. And instead of having these very, very talented journalists work as fixers or assisting kind of Western reporters who do parachute in. This is a way of them telling their stories directly to the world. For example, Mujahid Saadi, who reported from Jenin, a very, very talented journalist, very well known in the Northern West Bank and the West Bank in general. Great journalist. No one's probably heard of him in the English-speaking world. He was right beside Shirin Abu Akleh when she was murdered by an Israeli sniper. So, and there's much more to come. And so, supporting media outlets like Dropsite, that funding goes directly to funding a Palestinian journalist's work, which we need to do. And we see so often Western news outlets using the labor of Palestinian journalists, using their photos and using their reporting and not crediting them and not paying them and not acknowledging them. And I think it's very important that we give them an opportunity to tell their story to the world. So, and I thank everyone for tuning in.
Laila Al-Arian.
Thank you so much for everyone who stuck around this long. I would say with some exceptions, the coverage of what's happening in Gaza has been a monumental media failure and a abrogation of the responsibility that media have to shine the light on what's happening, to shine a light on injustice and hold the power to account, hold the powerful to account. For that reason, especially the fact that especially the Western media coverage has largely been so egregiously bad and dehumanizing, please do support the work that cuts against that. Whether it's Dropsite, whether it's this film, please pass it around. Please make sure that people don't forget Gaza, that they keep their eye on it, because the very least we can do is bear witness to what's happening there every day.
Well, Laila and Sharif, thank you so much for your powerful work. People follow Laila and Sharif also on social media, and do look out for this next film imminently that we're expecting from AJ Fault Lines that also deals with Gaza, and it should be out, Laila, right, in the next week or so.
Yeah.
And just thank you to all of our subscribers. I mean, we're now at over 231,000 people that are subscribers to Dropsite News. We are absolutely blown away by how many people also have written to us. We can also see that like a huge percentage of our subscribers are really actively reading articles and sharing them, and it means the world. Also, when we have a journalist that's on the ground somewhere and we can tell them, this hundreds of thousands of people read your article, it really is something that can make someone's day. And we're humbled by the support. We're almost at 6,000 paid subscribers. That's going to allow us to develop a sustainable model. We've been really conservative in any expanding because we want to be good stewards of the donations that people give us. We want to make sure that we're able to stay around long term. So we're filled with gratitude and humility when we think about the readers and subscribers. And mostly we're filled with humility when we think about the journalists on the ground in Gaza and in the West Bank who are operating under the most extreme circumstances you could possibly live and work under as a journalist. So on behalf of everyone at Dropsite News, our gratitude to the team that made The Night Won't End. Check it out, spread the word on it. And also thank you to all of our subscribers, our viewers, our listeners for tuning in. Tell your friends about Dropsite News, and thank you so much. We'll see you on the pages of the news organization.